Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Ferris, and today I'm going to be talking about a book that is what many would term a classic of Reformed theology, John Owen's The Death of Death in the Death of Christ. Now, Owen was a formidable intellect and a voluminous writer, a polemicist for Calvinism, and one who suffered both in his personal and professional life. Personally, Owen and his first wife had a total of 11 children, 10 of whom died in infancy, and the 11th, a daughter, died later. His public life was characterized by his nonconformist views. That is, he did not conform to the government of the Church of England. He was a dissenter and politically a Republican rather than a royalist. Owen's book, The Death of Death in the Death of Christ, is a defense of the definite atonement position. That is, that Christ's death was only intended to redeem the elect and not to provide an atonement for any others. In recent years, the term limited atonement has fallen out of favor with advocates of the position who instead prefer either particular redemption or definite atonement. The latter is intended to convey not what the atonement doesn't do, but what it accomplishes. I don't want to misrepresent the view, so I will refer to the position as definite atonement. For a long time, it was the case that Owen's arguments were considered unanswerable. That is, his presentation and logic were so airtight, so thorough, that no one could gainsay the position. That is the view that J.I. Packer takes in the foreword that he wrote to the 1959 Banner of Truth edition of Owen's work, saying that since Owen published his work, no other defense of the doctrine of definite atonement has been taken up because none was needed. Is Owen's exposition that good that the case on the atonement is closed? I don't think so. I think there are several weaknesses in his work, and I'll outline a few of these. First, Owen assumes a commercial understanding of the atonement. By this I mean that he conceives of sin in bookkeeping terms, in debt and monetary language, very much like fiscal debt. This culminated in the trilemma that Owen presents in the book, saying that God imposed his wrath, and Christ underwent the pains of hell, either for all the sins of all men, or for all the sins of some men, or for some of the sins of all men. Now, if you say some of the sins of all men, the third option, then obviously there are sins still to answer for. If you choose the first, all the sins of all men, then Owen replies, why then are not all men saved if Christ died for all their sins? His choice is obviously the second option. Christ died for all of the sins of some men, the elect. But here are several problems with Owen's position. First, as I mentioned, an overly commercialized view of the atonement means sin is quantified with great specificity. If the sum total, for example, of all sins the elect may have committed is 6,835,345,000 sins, then for 6,835,345 sins Christ has died, no more and no less. But this does not reflect the way the Bible speaks about guilt and how Christ's death satisfies it. And I want to mention here that one of the most lucid examinations of Owen's work comes from an unlikely source. In the mid-90s, Neil Andrew Chambers, a Master of Theology student at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, did his thesis examining Owen's Death of Death. So, not an Arminian or a Wesleyan school, but Reformed seminary. And here, Chambers points out that Owen's commercial language doesn't account for things such as Colossians 2, where Paul speaks of canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. Now, Chambers comments that this certificate of indebtedness is not paid, but canceled by being destroyed, with no suggestion of the payment of a debt to anyone. Thus, the points of contact between the world of commerce and the death of Jesus are severely restricted by the context, permitting no extension of the metaphor of debt to allow it to control the presentation of the work of the cross. And this metaphor does indeed pervade Owen's entire concept of the atonement. Indeed, other Calvinists have rejected the double payment argument as a misunderstanding of the atonement. I'll give a couple of examples. Charles Hodge, one of the deans of American Presbyterianism, noted that the character of the atonement is not a monetary debt, and thus speaking in this sort of language is incorrect, but it is a judicial debt, and there is no grace in accepting a pecuniary satisfaction. It cannot be refused. It ipso facto liberates. The moment the debt is paid, the debtor is free, and that without any condition. Nothing of this is true in the case of a judicial satisfaction. That's from Hodge's systematic theology. Consider also what W.G.T. Shedd said in his dogmatic theology. The fact that a vicarious atonement has been made that is sufficient to expiate his sins does not stop justice from punishing him personally for them, unless it can be shown that he is the author of the vicarious atonement. If this were so, then indeed he might complain of the personal satisfaction that is required of him. In this case, one and the same party would make two satisfactions for one and the same sin, one vicarious and one personal. In other words, unless the person being punished had himself previously paid the penalty, then it is not unjust to punish him for those sins. In short, there must be application of the atonement before it is effective, and that application comes through faith. The second challenge is with Owen's own logic. That is, he asks, if the death of Christ pay for all the sins of all men, why are they not freed from the punishment of all their sins? But the same question can be asked concerning the second group, the elect. For the elect are guilty sinners. They are under the wrath of God and deserving of hell until they believe. Yet, if the death of Christ itself released them from their debt, how could this be? How could Paul tell the Ephesians, who were believers, elect, that they were all children of wrath after the death of Christ? Owen would agree that faith is necessary before anyone is saved, but his position ends up reducing faith to a footnote, an asterisk, on the atonement. This is because of his reliance on a covenant of redemption. And this is the second area of weakness I think his exposition shows. In Owen's concept, the Father and the Son entered into a pretemporal covenant by which the Son would give himself as a ransom, and the Father would give the Son, the elect, as the reward for his suffering and death. Importantly, the covenant included the purchase of faith for the elect, in Owen's view. Such a covenant rests on a lot of inference and implication. There is no clear biblical basis for such a covenant, and indeed it has problems. First, as David Allen has pointed out in his book, The Extent of the Atonement, a covenant implies one state or condition that prevails before it is ratified, and another that prevails after. But if something prevailed in the Godhead at one point and then later became something else, what does this say about divine immutability? Or, as some have said, Trinitarian harmony? Was there change in the Godhead? Second, Owen speaks in language of obligation. That is, because of the covenant of redemption, the elect are in fact owed salvation because of this compact. And the fact that the Son indeed did suffer and die for them, the Father must perform his side of the bargain. But all men are guilty before God and do not deserve redemption. Far less can we speak of God owing it to them. However, Owen argues most often from outcome to design. That is, if we see the outcome, that all men are not saved, then it must be by design that God intended to save only some. Owen's position rests on this logical precondition that those for whom Christ died will inevitably be saved. Owen is keen to avoid any idea of salvability or potential salvation as any intention in God's mind with the cross. He wants only definite salvation. But Chambers notes, if the elect are not saved at the cross, then they at least must, on a temporal, historical plane, be regarded as salvable. Then on the historical plane, the plane upon which we live and the gospel is preached, it is correct to say that Christ died for all and any that they may be saved. Owen cannot say this, but there is a stubborn temporality in the application of the gospel, which insists on the maintenance of the prominence of the sufficiency of salvation. The last area I want to discuss are those verses that state a universal provision in the atonement, and here is where Owen falls back on what I think is strained logic and equivocation. 1 Timothy 2, where we read that God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, for example, Owen says, the whole strength of this argument lies in the ambiguity of the word all. And he goes on to note that the word occurs over 500 times in the New Testament. But context is key, and the context of this passage presents no such ambiguity as Owen claims. God has provided a ransom for all, but Owen can't agree to this because it undermines his entire argument for definite atonement. Another example is his treatment of the word world, as he claims it often refers to the elect. Of John 3:16, Owen explains that world there designates miserable, sinful, lost men of all sorts, not only Jews but Gentiles also. While it is true that world can sometimes mean less than the entire sum total of humanity, it is in this context incorrect to place a quantitative limit on world. As D.A. Carson has said, all the evidence of the usage of the word in John's Gospel is against the suggestion. True, world in John does not so much refer to bigness as badness. In John's vocabulary, world is primarily the moral order in willful and culpable rebellion against God. That's from Carson's book, The Difficult Doctrine of the Love of God. Owen's paradigm of arguing from outcome to design leads him to some other rather odd views. For example, the passage in 2 Peter 2, where we read that there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them. Of the passage, Owen says, all things here, as to any proof of the business in hand, are exceedingly dark, uncertain, and doubtful. He goes on to question whether master here even refers to Christ, since the Greek word despotes is used and is uncommonly applied to Jesus, says Owen. If not Christ, one wonders who. If God himself, then is the argument at all undermined? I don't think so. It's interesting to note as well what Augustine said about whether those who deny the Lord had been bought by him. For he threw down the price of silver, for which by him the Lord had been sold, and he knew not the price wherewith he had himself by the Lord been redeemed. This thing was done in the case of Judas. I could go on and discuss a lot more because The Death of Death in the Death of Christ is not an easy book. It's tightly reasoned, exhaustive, sometimes repetitive, and let me say there are some arguments for definite atonement, but I think the tenor of the New Testament teaching does not support the view. And this is why I think ultimately Owen does not carry the argument because of what I mentioned earlier. He approaches the topic with prior assumptions about the nature of the atonement, with Aristotelian cause and effect logic, and because of these a priori assumptions, they lead him to some rather odd interpretations of the clear passages that speak of Christ's provision for all. Now, if you hold to unlimited atonement, as I do I think you should not read this book? Absolutely not. In fact, I think you should be familiar with the arguments so you can be well informed. Thanks for listening.